People believe danger is obvious. They imagine it as loud, violent, unmistakable. A scream in the night, a struggle that demands attention. A moment so clear that anyone would know exactly what they're looking at. My friends, I believe we've become so used to watching movies that we can't tell what's what in real life. But in some cases, real danger does not always introduce itself that way. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is controlled. Sometimes it walks past you in daylight, and you do not recognize it for what it is. Because people don't just see or look, people also interpret. And when something does not match the version of danger they expect, they look away without even realizing it. Elizabeth Smart was not hidden from the world the whole time. That is what makes this case so terrifying, especially for parents who have growing little children. This story we're about to tell is the abduction of Elizabeth Smart. On June 5, 2002, in Salt Lake City, Utah, USA, a 14-year-old girl was taken from her bedroom. Her name was Elizabeth Smart. Inside that home, something happened in a way that could not be undone. Her younger sister, Mary Catherine, was there. She heard the voice of a familiar man and saw enough to understand that something was wrong. But fear does something powerful in moments like that. It forces you to freeze and convince yourself that survival means staying still. And so in the seconds that mattered most, as for Mary Catherine, silence took over. The man who entered that home was not a stranger, in a way that people imagine strangers. He had been there before. Brian David Mitchell had worked at the Smart home for a single day, long enough to see, to learn, and to understand the layout of the space he would later invade. People like to believe danger comes from the outside, but sometimes danger studies your house first. Brian David Mitchell did not rely on force alone. He built something more dangerous, a system. He presented himself as a religious figure known as Emmanuel David Isaiah, a man who dressed in robes as presented in Old Testament texts, and who proclaimed himself as a prophet of God, a man who created his own belief system and wrote a manifesto entitled Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah. In that manifesto, he outlined apocalyptic visions and that he was given authority by God, that he would take multiple wives, and that what he does is part of a divine mission. This is a man who spoke calmly and appeared devout, like how you see religious leaders. He told Elizabeth that it was fate that brought her to him, and that it was a religious duty to consummate their marriage. Even though Elizabeth was just 14 years old, this was a reality that Elizabeth was forced to face. A narrative she did not choose, and a role she was compelled to perform. So in this situation, control was not physical, but rather it was psychological in nature. Well, spiritual, even. I couldn't imagine what Elizabeth's thoughts were during this time. A girl who was a devout Mormon was forcibly taken by an excommunicated Mormon who claims to be sent by God to do holy missions. Can you imagine? My God. Elizabeth's seclusion made outside reality feel distant. Mitchell's unpredictability made resistance feel dangerous. And fear made obedience feel safer than defiance. And within that system, there was Wanda Barzee, Brian David Mitchell's wife, who was not simply present, but a willing participant of this hideous thing. So this was not one person acting alone in chaos. I don't know if this should be called a cult. Whatever it is, this was a constructed environment where fear, ritual, and domination reshaped what reality felt like from the inside. There's a question people ask in cases like this. It sounds so simple. Why didn't she run? Although it's an understandable question, but the thing is, something understandable doesn't mean it's true in that sense. Allow me to explain. Most people would assume that escape is always a visible option. But inside Elizabeth's captivity, that option to escape is broken. Why? Because she was threatened not just of her own life, but the lives of her family. During these times, punishment was demonstrated, repeated, and reinforced. Over time, fear stops reacting to danger. It starts anticipating it, calculating every possible consequence before a single move is made. What looks like a chance to escape from the outside can feel like a guaranteed negative consequence from the inside. As a result, survival may start to look like compliance, or interpreted as sympathy, or survival may even be seen as Stockholm Syndrome. Not because the person has given up, but because they're adapting to a system designed to punish every attempt at resistance. So this is where the story changes because this is no longer about just what happened. It is about how trauma reshapes decision-making in ways that are invisible to people who have never lived inside that kind of fear. During her captivity, Elizabeth was physically with people. What I mean is, she walked past people, she stood near strangers. A police officer even approached them and asked them if they had seen Elizabeth. You may be wondering, if this was the case, then why wasn't anyone able to recognize her? Like the usual questions. Why didn't she tell the police officer that it was her that time, that she was Elizabeth Smart? The truth is, you can't really recognize someone who is heavily disguised. Elizabeth was covered from head to foot, wearing the same biblical-looking garments as her captors. And her face is also covered. And more importantly, she was not alone during these times that she was out and about. She was with the very people controlling her. So, I believe that changes everything, right? Because people don't just look at people and think, oh, does she need help? Is she in distress? She's dressed in clothing that's not usual. Let's just let them be. A girl standing beside adults doesn't immediately mean there's danger. A quiet presence doesn't always usually trigger alarms. This is because we, the society, is programmed to see distress as something loud and visible. To demand intervention, the human mind needs a provocation or a signal or a stimulus. However, coercion in some real-world cases may also look quiet, confusing, and socially ambiguous. So allow me to ask this question. How can a missing child walk outside in public and still remain missing? Because when a person does not match the script of what we believe a victim should look like, we often fail in recognizing them as one. In the early stages of the investigation, the attention focused heavily on a man named Richard Reese. He had a criminal background. He had a connection to the family. His profile checked all the boxes of the potential kidnapper. And in high-pressure cases, early theories can become anchors. At the same time, Mary Catherine's recollection, particularly the recognition of the voice known as Emmanuel, did not immediately reshape the direction of the investigation with the urgency it might have deserved. This is not about assigning simple blame. This is about understanding a set of patterns. So when investigators are under pressure, when leads are overwhelming, and when uncertainty is high, the human mind looks for something to hold on to. And once that anchor forms, other possibilities can become harder to see. In this case, that anchor became Richard Reese. He was a handyman with a criminal record who had worked at the smart home. Investigators focused on his proximity and history, questioned him extensively, searched areas connected to him, and monitored his movements while he was in custody on unrelated charges. But while that focus narrowed in one direction, another lead was quietly taking shape. Mary Catherine, the only witness inside the room that night, eventually provided enough detail to help construct a composite sketch of the man she heard and partially saw. The figure known to the family as Emmanuel. But that sketch was not immediately released to the public. Investigators made a deliberate decision to hold it back. At the time, authorities stated that releasing certain details too early could jeopardize the investigation and risk compromising potential leads or eliciting false confessions. They also expressed concern about protecting the integrity of witness testimony and avoiding contamination of future identifications. So, in simple terms, the image existed, but the public did not see it immediately. Eventually, it was not law enforcement that brought the sketch into the public eye. It was the Smart family. Believing that time was critical, the family chose to release the composite through the media themselves, pushing the image into public awareness. This was when the case propelled further, because the evidence, the composite sketch, was no longer limited to the police. The public can finally connect the facial sketch to a real person. Time and time again, across different cases in different countries, like in the case we've talked about before, Emily Meng's disappearance in Denmark, the public has proven to be one of the most powerful witnesses because people notice details, a face, a car, something that feels slightly off. And when enough of those fragments are seen and shared, finding a missing person becomes possible in a way no single investigation can achieve alone. On March 12, 2003, in Sandy, Utah, something finally happened. A man walks along a suburban street. Beside him was a woman, and just a few steps away, a girl who is covered and disguised. The world went on like usual, until two separate couples notice something they can't quite ignore. They recognize this man and have seen him before. Then they realize they'd seen him on TV, in reports, in the background of a story the world had been following for months. So they called the police, and the police mobilized. Finally, after 9 long months, Elizabeth has been found. This liberating moment reveals something deeper about how cases like these are solved. It is not the most promising clue that breaks a case open. It might be as simple as finally recognizing coercion as it is. The world did not suddenly find Elizabeth smart. The world finally understood what it was actually looking at. Brian David Mitchell was later convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee pleaded guilty and served time for her role in the case. But the story does not end at conviction, because survival is not the same as those movie endings we know, where the character finally gets to live a good life. It is usually the beginning of something far more difficult and grueling. What follows survival is not relief alone, but a painful and inevitable reconstruction. For Elizabeth Smart, that may have meant learning how to live in a world that now knew her name, her trauma, and a version of her story that could never fully capture what she endured. She carried the weight of what had been done to her, and the weight of how people would respond to it. Questions, judgments, misunderstandings, victim stigma. The kind that asks quietly or openly, why did she not fight harder? Why did she not run? Why did she not do what people imagine they would have done? This is the stigma that many survivors face, where survival itself is scrutinized, where coping is mistaken for compliance, where the complexity of trauma is reduced to simple, unfair questions. And yet, Elizabeth Smart did not disappear into that silence. She stepped into it. She spoke. And she reframed the narrative not as a story of passivity, but as one of endurance, adaptation, and survival under conditions most people will never fully understand. She became an advocate, using her voice to challenge the myths surrounding trauma, to educate the public on what coercion and fear actually do to the human mind, and to stand beside other survivors who have been misunderstood in similar ways. Elizabeth was not just a survivor of a crime. Elizabeth was a witness to what survival really demands. And a reminder that what happens after rescue is not the end of the story. It is where the long, often invisible work of healing begins. The Elizabeth Smart case forces a confrontation with something uncomfortable. A kidnapped victim could stand feet away from strangers, disguised and silent, and still remain unseen. A person can be alive, present, and within reach, and still be trapped inside a system of control that others do not understand. It exposes how coercive control works, how fear shapes behavior, how often the public fails to recognize distress when it does not look dramatic, or it does not look what they expect dramatic or in distress to be, and how investigations, like all human processes, can be shaped by early assumptions. But more than anything, it exposes a gap between what we think survival looks like and what it actually is. People believe that danger is obvious, that if it were happening, they would see it, that if it were real, someone would have stopped it. But Elizabeth Smart lived through a reality where fear was engineered, where silence was enforced, and where survival required choices most people never have to imagine. She was seen, and still she endured. Not because she failed to act, but because she found a way to survive inside a system designed to break her. And that is not weakness. That is courage. Most people will never be tested to understand. So before we ask what she should have done, we should first understand what she was forced to survive. Because when fear teaches someone in that situation that silence is safer than freedom, what exactly are we asking when we say, "Why didn't she run?"